In March, the Indians and New Zealanders attacked once more. The battle seesawed back and forth for 2 days and 2 nights before the Allies fell back to where they'd started. "4,000 men were lost. The Germans held. In the mud and snow and bitter cold, the killing went on.
You'd get a guy in and he looked okay, but a little further on, there'd be a medical guy. He'd say, you know, this guy's going. And I said, should I stop? He said, yeah, why don't you stop for a minute? So I went back and held his hand, and, you know, he just looked up and kind of gave a sign of recognition, and he was going. It's quick. I don't, it's hard to describe what it's really like. You can remember the moments, but you see some guy leaving this world, it's not a lot of fun.
Training camp of its kind in the world, 800 colored rookies get their basic physical build-up for eventful days to come. 10 weeks ago, they were coal miners, steel workers, mechanics, professional boxers. In fact, most everything from college teachers to Pullman porters. A few weeks more of this intensive drill, and they'll become the field artillery replacements of the famed 16th Battalion, a compact fighting force of cannoneers, radio and signalmen, an all-Negro group assembled from all over the nation, a well-trained unit ready and eager to join the fight for survival of the great democracy that gave them birth.
All right, men. On behalf of the United States Army, the reception center here at this camp, we're glad to welcome you here today and into the United States Army. We're glad to see all of your happy, smiling faces. You'll be converted from a civilian into a full-fledged soldier.
When I went in, they had a pad, and eyes, Negro, hair, Negro, color, Negro, complexion, Negro, race, Negro. Everything was Negro except height and weight.
Despite the bravery of African Americans in all of America's previous wars, despite the argument made by the NAACP and others that a Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world, the armed forces of the United States remained strictly segregated. Growing protest by African Americans would force the military to make a few changes. An Army Air Corps training camp was set up at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. A single ship, the USS Mason, was manned entirely by blacks, except for her commander. The 761st Tank Battalion would eventually fight in Europe, sent to the front by George Patton with the admonition, I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. The Marine Corps had refused to accept any blacks at all. But after 1942, as casualties in the Pacific mounted and pressure from civil rights groups intensified, John Gray and others were finally allowed to sign on and serve in segregated units.
They did not intend to have blacks as fighting units. They intended to have them, if at all, as support units. Look like you ought to appreciate the fact that you're not up front. But they didn't want you to get that kind of a glory.
John Gray was sent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where he joined the 51st Defense Battalion, one of only 2 black units being trained for combat in the Marine Corps. Its commander was Lieutenant Colonel Floyd Stevenson, a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor, who won his men's loyalty by declaring, "There is nothing that black troops cannot be taught." He was a far cry from the officers John Gray was used to.
And that was different from Major Lawson, who said he had been out in the jungles and he had fought this and he had done that. And he came back to find women Marines and dog Marines, and then you people. We didn't like for people to say, "you people." So instead of referring to troops as troops, they would always refer to black troops as "you people." And we resented that.
John Gray and his unit were eventually sent to the South Pacific. They had been trained as expert gunners on 90 and 150 millimeter guns, and were so skilled, Gray remembered, we could shoot the sting off a bee. But their white commanders did not see fit to send them into battle. The men took to calling themselves the Lost Battalion because they had so little to do, and white Marines resented their presence, especially when Samoan women were involved.
When they got a chance to dance or something, and those girls were told that we had tails. So when a girl would dance with you, she would reach down and try to see if you had a tail. But those girls would be so glad to have the treatment. So they extended separate but equal, so to speak, into the armed services.
To fly fighters. And by the luck of the draw, I was sent to Harding Field at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. That's where they had the P-47 Thunderbolt, and that was the plane I wanted to fly.
The war offered Quentin Annenson of Laverne, Minnesota, a chance to realize his boyhood dream of flying. Colorblindness had kept him out of the Army Air Corps until he took the test enough times to memorize it. In early 1944, he was one of hundreds of thousands of men being trained to play their part in the coming invasion of France.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was a powerful airplane. We could carry 2 500-pound bombs under the wings, or we could carry 2,000-pound bombs under the wings. We carried up to 10 rockets. We had 8 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings that had a rate of fire of 600 rounds a minute per gun. So we, in a second, we could throw 100 shells on a target and just devastate anything that was in front of us.
Fighter training in Baton Rouge was exhilarating, but dangerous. 5 members of Annenson's group of 40 trainees died before they got a chance to go overseas.
been there only about 10 days or 2 weeks when I met Jackie. I went to a dance that was put on by a girls' club that she belonged to. And this absolutely darling girl came up.
And that particular night, I had a darling Valentine dress, you know, the red and the white stripes and all.
There was a song called Paper Doll that was so famous at that time. And as I took her to dance with her, I said, "Hello, Paper Doll."
We did have our dance, and we danced for about 5 minutes. The music stopped to let the band rest, and I went home. And when I got home that night, my sister was already in bed asleep. We slept together, and I woke her up, and I said, "Nelwyn, tonight I met the man I'm going to marry."
Well, we had 90 days to work with, from the time I met her until the time I shipped out to go overseas. We would go to parties, and we saw each other almost every night. And we knew within a matter of just a short time that this was something serious, and everything was, it's sort of like on fast forward. You live your life realizing that you don't have a lot of time.
Before he left for England, Annenson laid down some ground rules for Jackie.
So I said that I'd like to make a deal with you. I will come back and survive this war if you will agree that while I'm gone, that you will not date any one guy more than 3 times.
I don't know where in the world he came up with that. I never did understand it. But the rule was I couldn't have over 3 dates with any one fella. And he explained it that I wouldn't get too familiar with them in 3 dates, and if I couldn't have any more, it couldn't go any further. And it surely worked.
Waterbury at that time during the war was like, you could almost compare it to a miniature Times Square. It was never quiet because there were so many factories, and each factory had 3 shifts, so they're going around the clock. So you had buses running up and down from the center of town to different streets all over the city, going constantly.
Like Mobile and countless other American towns, Babe Charlo's hometown of Waterbury, Connecticut was booming. Its peacetime industries had all switched over to defense and were working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Workers came to Waterbury from everywhere.
While looking for work, there was one memorable morning when I got on a bus, sat down next to somebody who turned to me and said, "Good morning." And I looked at him as if to say, "Who are you to say good morning to me after I'm from Brooklyn, New York?" But anyway, the impact was very great. The friendliness that I found in Waterbury was something I was not accustomed to.
23-year-old Leo Goldberg quickly got a job as a saw sharpener at the Scoville Manufacturing Company. Scoville produced so many different military items, the Waterbury Republican reported, that there wasn't an American or British fighting man who wasn't dependent on the company for some part of the food, clothing, shelter, and equipment that sustained him through the struggle.
having a job and no attachments, it gives you a freedom. You don't have to answer to anybody. Hey, Mom, I'm going to stay out until 10 o'clock, or you got to be home by noon hour, or whatever it was. So it was a burst of freedom. So couple that with the friendliness. I got to know people. I went horseback riding for the first time in my life. I never knew what a horse looked like. And it was just great.
Waterbury also sent group after group of draftees to the war. 12,000 of them. The mayor saw them all off at the railroad station. Each man received a prayer book and a carton of cigarettes, courtesy of the Shriners. Meanwhile, young Waterbury women did their best to keep in touch with the men overseas.
We wrote letters to all the boys we knew. And they loved getting the letters because they said at roll call, they wanted their name to be called over and over because they said it was so wonderful. They loved these letters because we told them where we went last night. We went for a hot dog or something. You know, I mean, it wasn't anything bigger. We went to the USO dance and we saw so-and-so there. And at Christmas time, they got boxes galore. My whole kitchen table, my mother used to help, everybody helped. And we sent boxes to all of them.
From guns hidden in the Alban Hills, the Germans continued to hurl artillery shells at the Allied troops pinned down at Anzio. For more than 8 weeks, since the end of January 1944, they had been stuck there. With the American forces was Private Bill Malden, a cartoonist for Stars and Stripes.
There wasn't any rear. There's no place in the entire beachhead where enemy shells couldn't seek you out. Wounded men got oak leaf clusters on their purple hearts when shell fragments riddled them as they lay on hospital beds. Nurses died. Planes crash-landed on a single airstrip. You couldn't stand up in the swamps without being cut down, and you couldn't sleep if you sat down. Guys stayed in those swamps for days and weeks.
After one massive shelling, a mess sergeant fell to his knees and began loudly to pray. God help us, he said. You come yourself. Don't send Jesus. This is no place for children. Some 7,000 Allied personnel were killed during the Anzio campaign. 36,000 more were wounded or missing, and another 44,000 were classified as non-battle casualties, victims of frostbite and trench foot, shell shock, and madness. Axis Sally, the Nazi radio propagandist, began calling Anzio the largest self-supporting prisoner of war camp in the world. And German aircraft littered the beach with leaflets urging Allied soldiers to surrender. The beachhead, they said, has become a death's head. On the front line with the 3rd Infantry Division, Babe Charlo saw all of it, took part in some of it, but never said a word about any of it in his letters home.
March 27, 1944. I just got through with Chow. We are having beautiful weather here, and I hope it's the same way there. So you could take the babies out every afternoon.
He never mentioned a word about what he was doing, where he was. You couldn't say much about where you were anyway, but it was always the upside. I could only write a few lines right now because I'm going to Chow and I don't have time. This is in the heat of the battle, and he's going to Chow line. I mean, there's no such thing as a Chow line when you're in the... But you don't realize this at the time until years later. You get a little smart and you go, geez, you know, how could he be going to a Chow line when you're in the middle of a battle or you're on a foxhole or someplace? But he always had that upbeat outlook about it.
April 14, 1944. I am in the very best of health, and I hope to hear the same from all of you always. Well, things here are moving pretty smooth, and the only thing I do is eat and sleep. And if I keep it up much longer, I'll be like a barrel. Well, take care of yourselves and keep those stoves roaring, because I'll be doing a lot of eating when I get home.
By the end of April, the Allied command was determined to break the stalemate and resume its drive toward Rome. Babe's division had finally been pulled back to rest and to get ready for the big battle to come.
April 30th, 1944. Dear Mom and family, this afternoon, I might go swimming in the Tyrrhenian Sea. The salt water will do me good. Well, I had my dinner, and guess what I had? Pork chops. About a dozen of them. I'm getting to be a chow hound. Love, Babe.
The Allies are stalled at Anzio, but patrol clashes are frequent. Here's a German outpost.
You see probably on the newsreel, or you read about it in the paper about different battles. But you don't actually put Babe in that position because he's always telling you how everything is fine. Everything is no problem. At one point, as a matter of fact, my mother had my aunt write a letter in Italian that she had sent to Babe. When you get to Rome, when you get to Italy, we have relatives over there. When you get there, show them these letters and they'll treat you well and everything else, you know? And at the time, you think, well, yeah, he's going to go to Italy, he's going to go to Rome, and he's going to see his relatives. You imagine that? It's so unreal.
May 9th, 1944. I'm glad that you're going down to the beach with the babies, and I hope Mom goes down with you. because it'll do all of you good. I won't be with you this year, but I'll guarantee you I'll be there next summer. That's a date. I'm all right. Nothing ever happens here. I guess it's like Waterbury. Dead. Love, Babe.
By the middle of May, American artillery had managed to target German guns, and things at Anzio had calmed down a good deal. The rain of shells that had once fallen day and night was reduced to sporadic, harassing fire. In one sector, German gunners held their fire each afternoon while GIs played a game of baseball. In a ceremony on the beach, 37 foreign-born members of Babe's division were sworn in as American citizens. 300 men from his outfit attended a wedding between a first lieutenant and an army nurse. The bride cut the cake with a trench knife.
I figured out just what I'm gonna do after the war, when I get home. I'm gonna loaf for a while, and then I'm gonna work. And the next spring, I'm gonna get a car. Not bad, huh? May 19. I am in the very best of health, and I hope to hear the same from all of you always. Today we had a little rain, but it wasn't bad at all, because it cooled us off. We had beer again today, and I gave my share to the fellas. Mom, how you getting along? Fine, I hope, and keeping happy always. I'm doing good, and always happy, because I know you're okay. Love, Babe.
The heaviest Allied barrage of the war precedes a dawn attack in the final battle for Cassino.
On May 11th, Allied troops had begun still another assault on Monte Cassino. French forces from North Africa battled their way behind Cassino and began to choke off German supplies. Polish troops, eager to avenge the Nazi invasion of their country, finally took the ruined monastery and the positions around it. The Gustav Line had broken. The Germans began falling back. Monte Cassino was in Allied hands. Meanwhile, at Anzio, General Mark Clark ordered his forces there to begin their own offensive on May 23rd. He was determined to break out of the beachhead and link up with the Allied armies coming up from Cassino to trap the enemy now retreating northward. Babe's regiment helped lead the way, finally taking the fiercely defended village of Cisterna they had tried to take months earlier. But when his men broke through, General Clark astonished his own staff and his British allies by racing toward Rome rather than trapping and destroying the retreating German army, which had been the original plan.
And when we finally did break through there, we didn't even beat the German army then. So that there wasn't a lot to show for all that. All of those casualties, all those terrible things. The only thing we did from a larger perspective was to keep a number of German divisions occupied there that otherwise could have gone to France or could have gone to Russia or somewhere else. But there wasn't a lot to show for it. It was horrible.
This is Douglas Edwards reporting that the Fifth Army, tanks and motorized infantry, has roared on through Rome today in relentless pursuit of two battered German armies. That's the picture in Italy as Allied planes continue hammering German-held Europe from the west. Now General Electric takes you direct to Rome. Winston Burdett reporting.
The people of this ancient and still splendid capital have seldom celebrated such a riotous holiday as they did today.
On June 4th, 1944, units of the Fifth Army marched into Rome.
A tremendous shout went up in the square when
It was Babe Charlo's 21st birthday.
we are bringing some 3,000 carabinieri into the city. Their return is a symbol.
Back in Waterbury, his sister Olga sat down to write him a letter.
Dearest Babe, it is now about 3:15 in the afternoon, and it's a beautiful day. We are all in the best of health and always hope to hear the same from you. We just had news a little while ago, and our American forces are in Rome. The Allies have passed the city limits in Rome, but they're not doing any fighting. Gee, I don't have to tell you anything. You know everything from beginning to end. Babe tried to tell us a little more about you, where you are, and what you are doing. We do hope everything is all right with you. Remember always to take good care of yourself. Well, babe, today is your birthday, and we do wish you a happy one. May all your wishes and dreams come true. Let's hope that you'll be home for your next birthday. I'm sure you will be. It won't be long now. We'll have the biggest party you've ever seen. Just keep your chin up. You're 21 years old, and what a man. We're all so proud of you, especially Mom. There's not a minute that goes by that she doesn't think of you. We all miss you and pray so hard for this war to end so you can come home. You said you sent home $30. We didn't receive it yet, but it will get here soon. Mama's going to put it in the bank for you, babe, so that when you come home, you can have everything you want. You can buy your car and all your new clothes. Well, babe, I guess I've said enough for now. Love from all. Take good care of yourself and write as often as you can. May God bless you and keep you safe. Our thoughts are always with you. Your loving sister, Olga.
"22 days later, on June 26, 1944, a telegram arrived at the Charlo home. Babe was dead. He may have been wounded as early as May 23rd, as his battalion struggled to take Cisterna during the first few hours of the Anzio breakout. 995 men from his division were lost that day. Perhaps the largest number suffered in a single day by any American Army division during the entire war. Hundreds more were killed or wounded during the next few days. Some of them hit by American fighter planes whose pilots mistook their advancing countrymen for retreating Germans. Whenever Babe was hit, however he was wounded, he died on May 27th, 8 days before his birthday. Among the belongings in his pockets were 2 rosaries, his driver's license, a wallet with 16 photographs of family and friends, a blood-stained letter, and $1.61.
Well, I was out that night with the girls. We had a sewing club. I came home, and after I got off the bus, I see all these lights lit, which is very unusual that my mother would have all these lights lit. And the closer I got to my house, lights were all over the place, and I can hear people talking. And as I went up the front stairs, I can hear my mother screaming, crying. My aunts, uncles, everybody was there. And I didn't know what had happened. So my aunt called me aside and told me what had happened. Well, it was a terrible night.
When I got upstairs and found out what happened, of course, a complete shock to all of us because we thought everything was fine. Babe says everything is fine. He's coming home soon, and it'll be great. So, to tell you the truth, I just went into my room, I closed the door, and that's where I stayed.
The news of Babe's death spread throughout the neighborhood.
And my girlfriend called me up. She's crying. I said, what happened? Babe Charlie was killed. You know, we couldn't do a thing for days after that. We didn't, because all we could think of is him. He was always so happy and jolly and always so fun-loving. And then I'm thinking, he's not coming back. And it was terrible. Because you started to realize that this isn't just going over there and they're not coming back. Some of them aren't.
Babe's mother refused to believe her son was gone. There had been some mistake. She was sure of it.
My mother, of course, was, well, how can I explain it? She was a disaster. We would be getting the newspaper, and my mother would look at pictures, and she'd say to me, there's Babe. That's Babe. And I say, gee, no, Mom. No, you have to write. You have to write. I don't know how many newspaper offices I would write to, magazine places I would write to, questioning the name of that boy that was in that picture. Because my mother always thought it was Babe, but it never came to be. It was so bad in our house that nobody ever knows. I used to play the piano ever since I was a young girl. When my father passed away, when my brother Babe died, my mother had no music in the house. I never played the piano again.
By the late spring of 1944, events were accelerating at last. In the Pacific, the Americans were on the move, and a large force was steaming toward the Marianas, the islands of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets had triumphed at Leningrad, then destroyed or captured some 250,000 German troops in the Crimea. But the basic fact remained that until the Nazi grip on Western Europe was broken, Allied victory was impossible. The German army had taken up new positions on the Adolf Hitler line, north of Rome. And the greatest test for the Western Allies, the long-delayed invasion of France, was now just days away. Back in Baton Rouge, Quentin Annenson from Laverne had to say goodbye to Jackie and prepare for war.
We were very much aware of the fact that it was a deadly calling. And we knew that the loss rates were extremely high. And so it was the Judge Advocate General's office that put this program in place, that all of us should have our wills drawn up. And of course, we knew the reality of our situation, and so we tried to make light of it, but nevertheless, we all signed our wills, drew up our wills. They were standard type wills. And there had to be 3 pilots that would witness the other pilot's will. The 3 pilots that witnessed my will were all dead in 6 months. We were all granted about 10 days leave for our final visit to our homes. This was around the middle of April 1944, so I went up to Laverne to see my parents, my brothers and sisters. And it was a very difficult time because I knew I had the orders in my possession that would be sending me to the European Theater of Operations. And I knew that we had been assigned to fly this terribly dangerous type of combat mission. So when I was leaving and saying goodbye to my mother and dad, we went to the train station in Laverne to catch the midnight train. My sister Mavis was with me, and I took her aside and we walked down the platform for a ways, and I told her what my assignment had been, and that the odds were pretty great that I would be killed. So I had told her to be very much aware of this possibility, and that she should be prepared to help my parents.
This immense piling up of war supplies in Britain is masked for the giant blow designed to knock out the Nazi. An astounding panorama of everything that you can think of and more. Invasion shipping massed in British harbors along the English Channel, barges and boats. Imagine those stacked up amphibious craft when they stream in swarms for the landing. Bombers, which in the ground invasion must keep on hammering. Gliders for airborne troops. And myriad fighter planes for the monster air battles of the offensive designed to be the final phase of the European war. Acres of planes reaching far into the distance.
By the late spring of 1944, on both sides of the world, there were signs that the tide of war had begun to turn. The Allies had stopped Japan's expansion in the Pacific. They had taken Guadalcanal in the Solomons and Tarawa in the Gilberts, had savaged the enemy fleet at Midway, and had begun the long climb from island to island toward the Japanese homeland. In the European theater, the Allies had cleared North Africa of Axis forces and taken Rome. Allied warplanes were still bombing Germany night and day. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won. The sea lanes were now open, and men and weapons and supplies were flooding into Britain. And in the east, the Red Army had driven the Germans from the Ukraine and was moving into Poland. Back home, in places like Laverne, Minnesota, Waterbury, Connecticut, Mobile, Alabama, and Sacramento, California, Americans did their best to go about their normal lives.
Kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since I can't remember when. It's been a long, long time.
But in the back of everyone's mind, hope was combined with dread. In spite of the progress that had been made, everything that had happened so far in the war had been a mere preliminary. The Japanese Empire had begun to shrink, but its rulers seemed determined to defend to the death every island that remained. Rome may have fallen, but everyone knew that Hitler's grip on Europe could not be broken until Allied troops crossed the English Channel, smashed the German defenses, and drove the Nazis out of France. Hundreds of thousands of sons and fathers and husbands would be called upon to gamble their lives for the sake of victory.
You'll never know how many dreams I dreamed about you, or just how empty they all seemed without you. So kiss me once.
Naval Ensign Joseph Vaghi of Bethel, Connecticut, just up the road from Waterbury, went home to say goodbye to his family that spring. He had his orders to go overseas, and it seemed to him and to them that he would likely be one of those who would be asked to run that terrible risk.
It was very difficult because I had two other brothers already in the service, and my poor mother, she knew all of us were going to go eventually, and as it turned out, we all did go. All of us were in the service, and that was kind of rough. But leaving, she had a chin up, you know. We spoke in Italian. She spoke English very well, but she said all of the sentimental things in Italian. She said, "Mio caro figlio, Dio stai con lei, e non dimenticarai mai I tuoi genitori. And it goes on like that.
Hundreds of miles of invasion coast are heavily fortified, bristling with gun emplacements, defense in depth, as Hitler prepares for the coming test of supremacy. Battle for the greatest of beachheads. Gigantic coastal guns go into place, ready to rise up when the 0 hour comes, when the Allies move on Hitler's Europe. No room for complacency. Hitler is prepared.
The Germans had known for months that the Allies were going to open the second front that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had been demanding since 1941. Hitler had used that time to construct his Atlantic Wall, 1,670 miles of fortified gun emplacements, radar and observation towers, and bunkers that stretched from Denmark all the way south to the Spanish frontier. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, more than 1.5 million Americans were now in Britain waiting for the signal to start the invasion. An invasion that would determine the success or failure of the Allied effort in Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower was in overall command. The assault was to proceed in 3 phases. First, paratroopers would be dropped behind the beaches in the dead of night to confuse the enemy and seize the roads and bridges that led inland from them. Then, wave after wave of airplanes were to batter German defenses, destroying enemy emplacements and creating craters on the beaches in which assault troops could take shelter. Finally, a massive flotilla was to ferry thousands of British, Canadian, and American troops toward the French coast. Allied commanders planned 5 coordinated landings along a 45-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline between the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River. Canadian and British troops under General Bernard Montgomery would fight their way ashore at beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, where they were also meant to take the city of Caen, 9 miles inland. Americans under General Omar Bradley would assault Utah and Omaha beaches.
Laverne, Minnesota, May 25th, 1944. Outwardly, things haven't changed here. The lilacs are out in full bloom. The countryside was never greener. At night, there are 1 million stars winking in the sky, with a couple of million bullfrogs parked along the edges of the bank-full ditches, croaking a mighty chorus. But things are different. The staffs of daily newspapers all over the country are on alert in case news of the invasion of Europe breaks. Key executives don't stir very far from a telephone, day or night. The belief is that the long-awaited flash will come sometime after 11 p.m., but before 5 a.m. Al McIntosh, Rock County Star-Herald.
We tend to call it the real war. The rest of it's just the showbiz war. The real war involves getting down there and killing people and being killed yourself or just barely escaping it. And it gives you attitudes about life and death that are unobtainable anywhere else.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
The greatest invasion in history began just after midnight on June 6, 1944, D-Day, as the first of 24,000 paratroopers flown over the channel in more than 1,000 aircraft were dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy.
The Germans' theory of the defense of the continent was they built pillboxes along the coastline, and they put their old troops in it. Then they put their Panzer divisions and their SS divisions and their good divisions back in central points. The theory being that when we hit the beach, they would come in from those points and drive us off. Our job was to get in between them and the beach and to have them hit us instead of the beach.
Most of the men of the British 6th Airborne dropped on target, reassembled, and within an hour had achieved their objectives, seizing bridges across the Orne and Dives rivers to keep German tanks from mounting a counterattack along the coast. On the western flank, the 16,000 Americans belonging to the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were less fortunate. Low-hanging clouds blocked the moonlight and obscured the landing zones. The narrow neck of the Cotentin Peninsula was hard to hit from the air. Many paratroopers fell helplessly into the sea. Others landed in fields and river valleys flooded by the Germans and drowned. Some were blown from the sky as German tracer bullets set off the explosives they carried. Still others were dropped so low, their parachutes had no chance to open. They hit, one man remembered, with a sound like ripe pumpkins being thrown down against the ground. The men of the 101st Airborne were scattered over an area 25 miles long by 15 miles wide. Elements of the 82nd Airborne came down in and around the little town of Saint-Mary-Église, just behind Utah Beach. The fighting was already raging when a glider carrying Dwayne Luce of Mobile, Alabama, headed toward the landing zone. A survivor of the invasion of Sicily and the landing at Salerno, he was a captain in the 320th Glider Field Artillery Battalion.
We had been in combat before, and we knew kind of what we were getting into, but we knew this was the big bang, and it was kind of a worrisome, you might say.
Gliders were something new in warfare. Silent, ideal for clandestine landings behind enemy lines, and capable of ferrying equipment and vehicles too heavy to be dropped in any other way. But they were also fragile, covered with flammable fabric, and hard to control. And in some landing zones, the Germans had placed forests of sharpened poles to tear them apart and impale the men aboard.